Thanks everybody for coming today. It's great to see so many of you show up to talk about the new BC Services Card. We've started a little late. We have one participant who's just managed to get over the border, another one who's traveling en route by ferry, but we've managed to pull it all together. And this workshop represents the culmination of almost a year-long research project funded by the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. So we're very excited to be here and to share our work with you. But first up, I'm going to introduce Josh Patterson. He is the Executive Director of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, and he's going to do some welcoming remarks.
Thanks very much, Kate. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, that our meeting today is taking place on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish nations of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So Haitchkitsiem to those nations who allow us to share in this land where we all live and work. And with that, I'd like to thank all the rest of you for coming here to join us today to talk about the BC Services Card, Privacy Risks, Opportunities, and Alternatives. As you know, the BC Services Card is in the process of being rolled out right now. We, along with great allies like the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, who are here today, have called for a halt to this rollout. The Privacy Commissioner of British Columbia, who I understand some representatives are also here today, so thank you for coming. The Privacy Commissioner's Office has also called on the government to go... Sorry, is there something we can do about that? Hello. So, where was I? Privacy Commissioner. The Privacy Commissioner of BC has also called on the government to go no further in its plans without extensive public consultations on the risks and benefits of this kind of data linkage. We don't think that public consultations alone are going to solve the problems associated with this new card. We need much more information and assurance as to how this data will be used and secured. We've asked the government to come clean on the card, and this is yet to happen. We know that when governments anywhere roll out big data integration proposals, they tend to fail. We've heard the same story from around Canada and around the world. Here in BC alone, the Ministry of Justice's case management database, Justin, is insecure and it's a mess. The province's student data system, called BCCLA, was a complete failure and must now be replaced at extravagant cost. The integrated case management system used in another part of government was described by the Representative for Children and Youth, a government watchdog, as a colossal failure. We are deeply concerned that we have another big data boondoggle on our hands here, but not just any boondoggle. This one raises concerns around privacy, around identity integrity, and democratic governance. And the need for the card has never been satisfactorily demonstrated. There's been no public discussion of the potential benefits and risks and where all of the benefit lies in this. In fact, today, as far as I can tell, is really one of the first times that any number of people are coming together in anything other than in an informal setting to discuss and debate this. And I'm proud that at the BCCLA we're able to spearhead bringing this together, and I really thank the other organizations and all of you as individuals for joining us here today and dedicating some time to talk about this. But this isn't enough. The public need to be let in on this process. This card brings the potential for government and its private sector technology providers to track, monitor, or profile individuals across different sectors of activity. This is an inherent threat to the privacy of residents here in BC, particularly as the temptation to start to use these vast amounts of data could become irresistible once they start to generate it. And that's something that we see time and time again whenever these new systems are built. At first they're built for some smaller purpose, and then there's a mission creep. It also threatens, this thing potentially threatens the life chances of users who could be denied services or entitlements based on profiling and other kinds of cumulative assessments and gathering together of information that is made possible by this card and this identity system. This is the kind of government initiative that cries out for meaningful and robust public consultation and debate, and that has not happened. And us having a meeting here today simply doesn't cut it. So for those of you, having sort of introduced the topic a little bit, and it's obviously one that's very dear to our hearts here at the BCCLA, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the BC Civil Liberties Association, because some of you know us well, some of you are on our board, some of you are our staff, and others may not know very much about us at all. So allow me to digress for just a few moments to tell you a bit about us. We're now in the 50th year of our fight to achieve justice, liberty, and equality, and the protection of people's fundamental rights. We are the oldest and the largest civil liberties organization in Canada, and we work on issues here in BC and right across Canada from the Canada. It's sort of like the colonial, like the Canadas. Sometimes we work in Upper Canada. I'll be in Ottawa next week. So working on issues in BC and right across the country from our base here in Vancouver. We have a mandate to preserve, to defend, to maintain, and to extend civil liberties and human rights right across the country. We're nonpartisan. And we do this in a number of different ways. We do it through advocacy, we do it through our public policy work, through community education, and through our justice program, our litigation. Education is so important to us because the only way that we can really protect these fundamental rights as a society is to have informed and vigilant citizens and residents. And I say not just citizens, but residents. Everybody who's here benefits from these rights. Everyone needs to be informed about their fundamental rights if we're going to be able to protect them as a society. We spend a lot of time on public education and awareness to make human rights and civil liberties a part of the conversation on everyday issues here in BC and right across Canada. We provide direct assistance to something around 2,000 individuals every year who request information or who have civil liberties or other human rights problems that we can either help them with or refer them to agencies who are better placed to help them. We do all of this, of course, at no charge to the public. Over the year, BCCLA has developed over 200 different policy briefs, many of them under the leadership of our policy director, Micheal Vonn, who I'm happy will be joining us on this panel just after me. These policy briefs serve as the principled cornerstones for our work. And part of our mandate, of course, is to meet with government, to meet with officials, to try and inform them, to try and change decisions around public policy and around the law before they happen, and to correct, inevitably, to correct decisions that are poor after they happen. And when all else fails, and when those government agencies refuse to bend to the wisdom that we're trying to impart to them, of course, we stand ready to challenge laws in the courts, and we do that all the time. We have a strong litigation program and a growing roster of cases at all levels of court, from the Supreme Court of Canada all the way down to the trial level. These cases and all of our work cover a broad range of concern, from democratic rights to privacy, to emerging technologies, to patients' rights, to police accountability and national security and discrimination, a wide waterfront of issues that we're working on because there are just so many spheres in which people's basic rights are threatened and need protection. And I want to just add that over the years, our work has come increasingly to emphasize the rights of very marginalized people. And this has seen us argue right here in this neighborhood. For those of you coming from other places in Canada, you might not be aware that it's in this neighborhood here, the downtown east side, what we're just on the edge of, where we have Insight, Canada's first safe injection facility, that we joined that fight to provide a safe place for injection drug users that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Our fights lately have seen us stand with First Nations people and sex workers right here in this neighborhood to call the police and the justice system to account for the epidemic of violence against Aboriginal women and girls and sex workers in the downtown east side and right across the country. So if you are supportive of that work and you're interested in being continually involved in it, I would encourage you to become a member. It's $35. There's these orange forms out here. It's fun. We're a bag of laughs. It's a party all the time. And because it's a party all the time, you will have noticed that we're selling these coochies for bottled drinks, alcoholic or non-alcoholic. Among all of the things that we fight for, these do say, I just couldn't resist picking this up, it wasn't part of my plan, fighting for your right to party since 1962. So these are only $4, that's a cost recovery, and you can get these at the front. I'd like to thank the Law Foundation of BC for their ongoing support of the BC Civil Liberties Association, which has always been steadfast and which enables us to do our work in the world. I'd like to thank the Privacy Commissioner of Canada for their grant support for this project. I'd like to thank our allies, like the aforementioned FIPA, Vince, Dave, and others who have been just steadfast allies with us in all of these fights going back for some time now. Openmedia.ca, who we will be honoring next month with a Liberty Award in the category of youth activism at our gala, which is on June 12th. And if you want to come to that, it's going to be super fun as well, keeping with the spirit. June 12th, you can buy tickets on our website. David Suzuki will be talking about how freedom of expression is becoming an endangered species. And anyway, so glad to see people from Open Media here today, and thank you for your ongoing dedication. I'd also finally like to thank the BCCLA staff and volunteers who've dedicated time and energy to this project and to today's event and to making them happen. Micheal Vonn, our policy director, who I'm sure all of you know already by her reputation. She's one of Canada's leading experts in privacy issues in the intersection of technology, and not to mention a leading expert in pretty much anything else that I have to ask her about. So thank you very much, Micheal. Dr. Kate Milberry, who's written our report and spent countless hours researching and writing to try to sort her way through what's actually happening with this new card, which I know has been a frustrating task because it hasn't exactly been a torrent of openness from the government on this. So thank you for that. I'd like to thank the authors of the technical report that we have here today, Chris Parsons and Adam Molnar. Jim Brownigal at our office, our administrator, helped pull the actual report physically together, and Charlotte Kingston, who's our membership and outreach coordinator. You would have seen her out at the front, and our volunteers who have been so wonderful in helping to make this event what I hope prospectively will be a success. It looks like a success for now. I'll leave it to you to judge whether my remarks have been successful. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kate and give you all my apologies that because I'm going away next week for work, there's some urgent things that have come up back at the office. I won't be able to stay around for very much longer this afternoon. So it's not out of a lack of interest for what you're talking about today. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. I did forget to introduce myself when I spoke earlier. I'm Kate Milberry, as Josh said, and I'm the lead researcher on the project, which was funded through the Contributions Program at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. And I wanted to draw your attention to, because I forgot earlier, the internet access information here, if you don't have it already. And there is a Twitter hashtag, so any of you tweeters, it's hashtag BCID. And the last thing I wanted to mention was you can, in addition to the Cushy for $4, for free, you can pick up one of these little, well, we don't know what they're called, but they're from the Office of the Information Privacy Commissioner of BC, and they're not Faraday cages, but they're protectors for your credit cards so that your credit cards can't be skimmed. So you can pick one of those up at the registration desk. And now, without any further ado and no further introduction, because Micheal Vonn doesn't need any more introduction, she, as Josh said, her reputation precedes her, and she is a dynamo on every subject that BCCLA takes up. So I will stop talking and bring up Micheal Vonn.
Hello. So nice to be here. So here's my role in the sort of kickoff of the afternoon. I'm going to look at you too. There you are. We have a discussion about the BC Services Card, and there's so many different angles to discuss this from. One of the things we thought would be a good idea is that we'd start by looking at the wide end of the funnel, because this is part of a much bigger movement that goes by a number of names. I'm going to use the name Transformational Government. So we need to kind of understand a little bit about what this mountain is that the BC Services Card is posited on. And I just want to acknowledge that there's a broad range of expertise in the room. Some of you may have some, pointed questions for some of our technical experts, but some people are here for general interest purposes. And so we want to make sure that just citizens can understand a little bit of the momentum that's at issue here and not make this, a realm for only the technical specialists to participate in the debate. So I'm going to take it from the wide end first, and then we're going to spend the rest of the day kind of honing in. So, transformational government. What are we transforming? This is language that comes from the United Kingdom, and it has a whole bunch, as I say, of different names. What it's really about is how we're going to use IT, how we're going to use new technologies, how we're going to use ubiquitous computing to transform government services in a couple of different realms. When I point to the UK, I do so for particular reasons. One, because they have a lot of cautionary tales for us about the transformations we can expect with transformational government. But also because our own government, the government of British Columbia, has been quite explicit that they would like to follow in the steps of the United Kingdom in terms of the modeling and the program. They did so in their government's corporate submission to the Special Committee reviewing the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So that's a 130-page policy document. Anybody read it? Yeah, you did. Okay, it was the corporate submission for the Special Committee reviewing the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And by gum, somebody in this audience has read it. This is fantastic. But most people, I think we need to acknowledge, have probably not read this document for good reason, right? We don't sit around reading policy documents. We're not kind of imbued in this environment. So we might not know that we have an express model that has been held up as the kind of direction our government and many governments would like to go. So let's start parsing what this could mean. Part of what's confusing around the language of transformational government is that it involves two distinct aspects of what we do with information, what government does with information. And this is a confusing element for most citizens, I suggest. When I first attended an event at the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, I came up to the desk and I actually asked, I think in a way that most people ask, I said, isn't freedom of information and privacy the opposite thing? Isn't there some tension there? What do you mean? And, surely or, right? Well, the sticky bit is the difference between government information, which we would like to be freely available, hence open government, and citizens' information, for which we would like privacy. Right? So these two prongs, government information or public information versus private information of citizens, are part of what confuses everyone about what we are transforming. So one arm of transformational government is typically referred to as open government. And about this component, there is no controversy. Nobody stands up and says, open government, what a bad idea. Right? Nobody. Everybody, at least in theory, at least in statement, is in favor of governmental transparency. Please show us the information. We, as sovereign citizens, have a right to know what our government is doing in our name, to participate in this process. So open government is uncontroversial. Now, in our own experience of open government, there are controversies within how the practices might evolve. And one of the controversies that we're seeing right now is the difference between open government in terms of making government-held data sets available to the government, and rather available to citizens, to residents, to people. This is kind of the new innovation, and it's pretty sexy, right? This hasn't existed before. We needed the kind of computing power and ubiquitous computing we haven't seen prior to this time to be able to do such things. And so there's been a lot of excitement around this component of open government, open data, right, where we make data sets available. Now, some people will say, well, this is pretty limited information for public participation. And there was a fascinating discussion at the last information summit that BC FIPA held, where people who had the technical expertise and the methodological expertise to be able to manipulate large data sets said, hey, as citizens, we can do some really groovy stuff with this. And suddenly we're hearing about projects like, I mapped out where car accidents have been happening in the last number of years so that you can look and see the safest route to send your kids to school. Isn't that a great thing to do with a data set? It is a great thing to do with a data set. Now, not many people can do it, mind you, but if you make that information in its synthesis available to large numbers of people, that's a great aspect. So, open government, the question is, or rather open data, the question is, who can use it? Are we getting the good stuff, right? And how helpful is it? But nobody is really against it. On the other side, we have the freedom of information side of the question, which is not what the government makes available in terms of data sets. It's what citizens request in terms of government information. And I think it's fair to say that we have not seen the same enthusiasm for this kind of advancement, development, enrichment of this side of the equation. And I can tell you that as a case study, the research for this project would be one of the indicators of this. So we've not seen a really robust standing up for freedom of information. We have seen some excitement around open data, and these are all concepts on the open government side of transformational government, okay? How we're going to use new technologies. So that's the government's information. Now let's go over to the much more controversial side of transformational government, which is our information. What is the government doing with our information, and how is it going to transform it? Well, this is where you get new language again, and sometimes referred to as horizontal government. Hey, there's a sexy term. Doesn't mean what you think. Joined up government, right? Ways to essentially break down the silos between individually held information sets of citizen data. To link data. Data sharing has become a ubiquitous term with government. We need more data sharing for better services. We need more data sharing for all kinds of reasons. We certainly started hearing this as a persistent drumbeat post 9/11, where the call was for national security reasons. Police, governments, intelligence agencies must, quote unquote, bring down the silos so that government can connect the dots. That was the call. Well, the rationale has changed over the years. We don't hear the call for bringing down the silos for national security purposes as much, but the current rationale that is very much kind of in the above place, right, in the ascendancy, is citizen services, right? We need to amalgamate, centralize, and share information for superior citizen services, for the efficacy of programs, for efficiency, because citizens require this kind of service provision. And of course, it is tied into new service delivery models, particularly online, right? You will hear people talk about the Mecca, if we had the ability to design it from the perspective of the designers, being a fully automated system. That would be the Mecca, right? The transformation of governmental services that involves the amalgamation of tremendous amounts of citizen data. Okay, so this is the other side of transformational government, joined up government. And the place where we're most familiar with this is assuredly electronic health records. And they provide us with a little bit of a lens into how these seemingly technical transformations are profound at the level of changing relationships, practice, status, and a whole bunch of other things that flow from privacy and security concerns. So, e-health, right, like e-government, right, the electronicization and uses new practices relating to, is much more transformational than people are being led to believe. Because again, the confusion here, and it's so difficult to parse this in media reports where you see electronic medical record, electronic healthcare records kind of thrown around as if they all mean the same thing. Well, they don't, right? People who are critics of the creation of this new system relating to our health data are often challenged as if we're Luddites, right? Well, you want everything carved in a stone tablet, don't you? Don't you know we have computers? Get with today, Grandma, kind of notion, right? I hear a lot of this. Simply put, nobody who is a privacy advocate or concerned about these systems doesn't think computers are a good idea. Everybody's all for computers. The question is, who owns the data? Where does the data go? Who has custody and control of the data? Are the servers local or some other controlled? Who has the ability to link the data? And all the other questions that you can't see when your doctor, your healthcare provider is typing into the computer, those are all things that are happening outside of the actual computer system, right? So the difference between your physician types your electronic medical record into their computer, local server, in their office, in their clinic, it's held exactly as it would be in the filing cabinet, except electronically, right? The physician has custody and control of that and ethical obligations around its privacy, statutory obligations around its security. Okay. Change this to the Ehealth System, right, in which those records now become compiled with a whole bunch of other medical information about you and held and distributed and controlled by another party, namely the government, right? So that information, although typed into this same computer, is now part of a longitudinal database controlled by the government. And that fundamentally changes the relationships that are involved here. Suddenly, the physician, the healthcare provider, actually can't guarantee confidentiality. And this is, again, not an editorial comment. Finally, in 2011, the Canadian Medical Association came out and admitted that. And they've been huge boosters of the whole e-health phenomenon. But finally, in their privacy policy of 2011, they had to actually inform physicians, and I suspect it was because their lawyers made them, had to inform physicians that they had an obligation to tell patients that once their information flows into an e-health system, meaning the centralized database controlled by government, that physicians could no longer guarantee confidentiality or assure that there wouldn't be inappropriate access. Right? How could they? They don't control the system. So this is an example of a fundamental change in relationship that is occurring because of how the information structures are shifting. And it doesn't relate only to eHealth. eHealth is the one that we know best because it's already in play, right? We're aware of this. We're aware of our information being put into computers. We're not always aware of which of those computer systems are actually linked to this larger enterprise. At the moment, we have health authorities that are centers of centralization, but as far as the provincial e-health system goes, the only health information bank that has been designated by the minister under the eHealth Act is the Public Laboratory Information System. So the part that we may not know, because I've asked lots of healthcare providers in British Columbia if they knew this, and they don't know. So if healthcare providers don't know, patients don't know, right? Right now, every laboratory test, requisition, and result in British Columbia is being held in a central repository controlled by the government. And that is accessible through tens of thousands of portals, because the idea, of course, is that this information collation is supposed to facilitate data sharing. So everyone who has roles-based access, meaning you meet a certain criteria in terms of your employment and your need to know, has access to this repository. Now, this is not a new idea, right? We have a very similar system and have had for some time in PharmaNet, right, which is our prescription information. So for some time now, every time your pharmacist types in a prescription for you into their system, that's being held in a central repository. And any pharmacist in the province has access to that repository unless you choose to lock it down. Okay? I always do this test. Who knew that you could lock down your PharmaNet records? Oh, you see? You are a very privacy-savvy audience. Still, that would be less than a quarter. I was a privacy lawyer for 2 years before I found out you could lock down your PharmaNet records. It's one of those interesting secrets that nobody tells you. And I want to tell a story about PharmaNet in relation to the new BC Services Card, but we'll get back to that. At the moment, just hang on to this notion that we've changed the relationships involved by changing the information flows, structures, and controls. And as I say, eHealth is the one that we know pretty well, but we are not just talking about health information, right? We're not talking about whether or not you can lock down your access to your medical records within the eHealth system, because there are some provisions, but they're clumsy and they're hard to find out about, right? For most people, you are simply in the repository and you have to trust that the people who have access to it won't do so maliciously, right? When you have that system where you aggregate data in what many security people call a honeypot, right? Where you put it in a giant clump in the center, what you get is, again, language that's very hard for people to understand, because you will have all kinds of people involved in these systems pound the table and yell, it's not a giant database, right? And they're right. It isn't a building with a giant computer somewhere. It's a longitudinal database. It's a series of things that link up, and it's exactly the same as if it were all sitting in the middle of the room, right? Okay? So however we fashion these in terms of our mind as we think of the kind of our spatial understanding of this, the important thing is, once we allow for interoperational access, it is as if we are creating that honeypot, whether or not physically it is true. Digitally, it is a honeypot. Digitally, it is centralized. Digitally, we have now changed the custody and control rules around the information, although from the front end, it looks exactly the same, typing on the computer, right? It's all happening kind of invisibly, these changes. When I say it's not happening just in the eHealth world, again, there's going to be a lot of shout out to BC FIPA today. BC FIPA some years ago wrote really the definitive report about how this exact same process was impacting a whole different series of ministries relating to information that would be involved in the Ministry of Children and Families, Ministry of Human Resources, etc. And this is the aforementioned ICM, Integrated Case Management System, right? And this operates essentially on the same model as eHealth. And it presents exactly the same problems, because it is not only, like eHealth, a matter of, and this would not be good anyhow, the government taking information from its own ministries and amalgamating it. It's that it involves the private sector as well. So add in that layer. Because, of course, your doctor, although they bill the government, is a private sector player. In the same way, integrated case management now involves a whole raft of community service providers who are no part of government. So when you go to your local community counseling service, your local community addiction services provider, your local community transition house, etc., those bodies may be funded by the government. And the government is currently taking the position through contract that if we fund you, your data is ours. Again, this is a kind of transformation behind the backs of people who are accessing the services, who have no reason to believe, in the same way that when you go to your doctor, you have no reason to believe you are providing that information to the government, except for billing purposes and other purposes that are perfectly legit. The substance of that, you don't believe that you are providing. But now these information transformations are creating these new relationships, new practices, and new exposures for people. So the pushback is with community-based service providers in relation to ICM, the Integrated Case Management System, because again, your obligations as the community provider are similar, although not identical, to the physician, right? You have ethical obligations around confidentiality, which you assure, and you have statutory obligations under the private sector privacy law, which says you do not disclose information that you collect without consent. And yet the government is saying, we own the data, and you're going to not only give it to us, but we are going to share it throughout government as we see fit for better citizen services. You can see how this is all getting to be somewhat problematic, right? No one who is accessing community-based services is having the understanding of what's going on, and the service providers are in a terrible place, right? Funding in jeopardy if they don't, trying to oblige by their statutory obligations, pressured in all kinds of ways. It's really an invidious problem that we haven't gotten to the root of solving. And part of why we haven't gotten to the root of solving is because we have not had a really concrete answer to the question, how does this improve citizen services? Right? We've heard it as a rationale. We keep hearing there's a bunch of rationales. It's going to be more efficient. It's going to do all of these things. But the question is, on what possible basis? We haven't seen any of this unpacked. We haven't seen the business case. And we know that this is having an impact on the front line. But it's one that, because it is so often invisible, has not got very much of the public profile that it needs to raise the issue at the point where we're going to get some real discourse happening. So this is all part of, as I say, this mountain that we are on as we look at this new edition, which is identity management, the BC Services Card, and how it relates to, one, the government's voracious appetite for our information, for whatever reasons, how it relates to how this impacts at all these other levels, and whether or not the rationales that are being presented actually hold water. And if they do hold water, are the processes that we've designed the ones that are the best for security, the best for privacy, and the best for the business case in the government, right? These are all the discussions that we should be having. But as I say, even getting to the what are we talking about stage is really difficult. So I want to give you an example, as I promised that I would do, with where the BC Services Card rationale may be meeting a disconnect. One of the rationales for the BC Services Card, which we're going to hear more about when our lead researcher gives you a lowdown on the research findings, is that it will essentially assist with identity fraud in the medical system. Well, as so often coincidence will drag up when you've got a talk on the go or you're having some subject, suddenly the complainant of your dreams will phone the BC Civil Liberties Association and tell you something you didn't know. Just this week, I had a phone call from someone whose identity had been stolen vis-a-vis medical services. And the story they had to tell had to do with a family member who took their name and birth date because they would know it, they're a family member, and that of several other family members, and were accessing prescriptions for painkillers from a series of physicians. And this had only been discovered when a theft was also involved, in addition to the identity theft, a physical theft. Something had been taken from one of the doctor's offices. And so the person had been phoned by the police who said, hey, we've got you now. You're Joe Smith. And Joe Smith come in to talk to the police. And Joe Smith walks in the police and they go, hey, you're not Joe Smith. We've got you on video camera. You're not the right person. So, of course, looking at the video footage, they immediately see what has gone on. And they start unpacking what's happened here. Now, you're probably thinking, hey, wait a minute, this is an argument for the BC Services Card, because those medical services plan cards are not very secure. The point of these interactions, and there were hundreds of them, was that no physician who made one of those scripts asked for the medical services plan card. It has a mechanism, it's crude, where your signature is on the back. You could be asked to duplicate it, never looked at. It has the potential for a PIN you can add to this, never done. So in terms of the security of this card, our investigations of where does medical fraud actually happen never occurred. We don't actually know in what ways we should be addressing medical fraud. But interestingly enough, the biggest case we have ever seen come through our doors, and we are only one aspect of where people might complain, didn't involve the card at all. It involved the fact that people don't use the security measures that exist, right? So we have to ask some really fundamental questions before we start an elaborate array of changes, some of which really are, I hate using the word inevitable because you hear that argument all the time. It's coming, you can't do anything about it, right? But clearly, we do need to look at how citizens could access some services online. There is some demand for that. It's the age for that. We need to address how we're going to update many of our systems. Modernization, as it's termed, is not a question or an option. We do have to update constantly. But the question is not, are we going in that direction? The question is, how are we going to go there? What kind of models are we going to use? On the basis of what evidence do we have that we have a problem? And are we really exploring and really understanding the detriment, the perils, the privacy and security problems that we're creating as we attempt to find a quote-unquote solution? So that's a little bit of the background, wide end of the funnel. We've got a raft of folks who are going to narrow in for you. My time is up, but I'm happy to, I think, take questions on the panel later. Or just quickly, is there anything that I said that doesn't make any sense? You want to ask right now? Okay, good enough. I'll be joining you later. Thanks so much for being here. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, Micheal. Micheal is always a tough act to follow, but I will do my best. So I have been researching the BC Services Card for the better part of a year, and as Micheal alluded to, this was a difficult task. Not because the work is highly technical, it is, or because it's, built on a series of dry and sort of obtuse policy documents, it is. Those are all things you expect. But the fact of the matter was there was almost no information at all on the BC Services Card. I can recall off the top of my head 2 documents that refer directly to the Services Card. This is a card that we know, thanks again to BC FIPA and their FOI, Freedom of Information Request to Government. We know that this the card itself has been planned since at least 2010. I began the research in 2012, and nothing. The first date, the original date for the card launch was November 30th, 2012. And as the fall approached, summer into fall, and closer to the rollout date, nothing, no information. I had Google Alerts set up. I was trolling the web. There were a few media reports from when the card was originally announced by government in May of 2011, and a few follow-ups here and there, but almost nothing. And so we conducted our own Freedom of Information requests in collaboration with BC FIPA, who were also continuing to do Freedom of Information requests on this topic. And all told, we did at least 10, 5 each by my count. And there are two that have been fulfilled, both belonging to FIPA. The original one, which is what I based a lot of the research on, which I think we got in early 2012, and one that just came in March last month. So when Micheal was alluding to the fact that government isn't really upholding its end of its open data initiative, that is truly the case in this instance. In addition to no documentation, the difficulty of getting documentation through Freedom of Information requests, we were also pretty much stonewalled when it came to talking to government. I tried to set up interviews with all three relevant government organizations. That would be Ministry of Citizen Services, and within Ministry of Citizen Services and Open Government. I always mix that up. The Office of the Chief Information Officer, and the Ministry of Health. And nobody, if they returned my calls, the answer was still no. So we couldn't interview the main ministers or the lead representatives. We eventually did have one representative from the Office of the Chief Information Officer who did speak with both myself and our technical researchers, and he was very helpful, but he wouldn't go on the record, or he wouldn't allow us to use his name. So it was very difficult getting any information on the BC Services Card, but it wasn't just us. The Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of BC also experienced a similar problem. The BC Services Card was delayed from November 30th, 2012 until February 15th, 2013. And on January 8th, the Privacy Commissioner released a statement saying that she could not complete her review of the BC Services Card project because she was still waiting on relevant documentation from the government. This was 5 weeks before the card was to be launched. Now, one might imagine that if you were conducting a radical transformation of the way that the government handles and treats sensitive personal information of citizens, that the Privacy Commissioner might be the first person you call. And she wasn't. And in fact, documents that we received through Freedom of Information requests indicate that when ICBC got a little nervous about this, what they were originally calling the Care Card Initiative, they were instructed and that they wanted to contact on their end. Their privacy managers wanted to contact the Privacy Commissioner. They were instructed by Ministry of Health not to. So this is problematic on a number of fronts. But I'm just going to briefly outline our findings with the report. And I need to mention here that I have a co-author on the report, and that's Christopher Parsons from the University of Victoria. And he co-authored our technical report, which reviewed the technical aspects of the card itself and as well the underlying technical infrastructure. And he also came in and helped me finish writing the report, and with his help was invaluable. And anyways, our findings. Well, do you know that the BC Services Card is mandatory? Pardon? Yeah. So the card is mandatory. Now the government says it's not mandatory. Of course not. It's not mandatory. But by 2018, everybody will have to have a services card in order to receive medical services plan. So if you would like regular access to healthcare in British Columbia, you'll need the BC Services Card. So that's almost everybody who lives in British Columbia, a large majority. Not only that, we learned subsequently that by 2014, the government will begin enrolling people who are not in the medical services plan. So if you fell outside of that if you fall into that very small group of people who don't receive MSP in British Columbia, you will now be enrolled in the program. So the other thing we learned fairly late into the game is that the card has a computer chip. It's called a near-field communication chip. It's somewhat similar to radio frequency identification chips, if you're familiar with that at all. And that won't be turned on. So we were assuming that when the card went live in February 2013, that you would be able to use it to access the online services, which has been one of the main promises of this card, that it's going to bring convenience and it's going to be so wonderful and amazing that you can do all these things online with your card. Well, you can't even do that. And a follow-up interview with the one representative who has spoken with us from the Office of the Chief Information Officer told me that they haven't even got their point-of-service counter procedure down. So when you do go in and show your card to whomever, at your doctor's office or a clinic or ICBC, they don't really have a process ready for you. This card has been planned for over 3 years. Interestingly, in the fall of 2012, the person who arguably spearheaded the BC Services Card, or at least is the face of identity management in BC, Dave Nicolation, the CIO, Chief Information Officer for BC, was quietly transferred. And we haven't heard much from his successor on anything. So it looks like there's things going on behind the scenes, and perhaps a reticence, that explains the reticence of the government providing documentation to our research team. In any case, the chip won't be activated for probably 5 years, and nevertheless, the card is still part of what Micheal was referring to, this technology and transformation strategy that the province has adopted wholesale. It's almost like they've drunk the Kool-Aid. So, findings. Micheal also alluded to this. There's no real evidence-based rationale for the card. There's a number of justifications that the government trots out. One is to reduce medical fraud. Micheal has already discussed that. I don't know if you recall hearing in the PR campaign around the card in early January. We heard a little bit about it in November when the card launch was delayed. The Minister McDermott saying that there were 9 million cards, healthcare cards in the province, and there's only 4.5 million eligible MSP recipients. So there must be a lot of healthcare fraud going on, hey? Well, in fact, other Freedom of Information requests done by other researchers uncovered that, in fact, the government knew very well, and Minister McDermott admitted that we know the government knew very well these were fraudulent cards. Many were legitimate, many were just naturally, the people had moved out of the province, or they had died, or there were duplicates, but they weren't being used fraudulently. All sorts of reasons to indicate why there might be twice as many cards floating around. And what we learned from that is the government had no audit system in place. They were just handing out healthcare cards apparently willy-nilly. And so a simple audit function, which is what they did in Ontario after conducting an audit of their health card program, that's all that's needed. So do we need this radically transformative identity and information management system complete with card? There's no case. That simply has not been made. Other rationales include improved patient safety. That would be a great thing. And it's a nice thing to say, but we don't know anything. There's no evidence to suggest that this will happen. Cost savings, no business case has been made. We don't know how much money that could potentially be saved through the BC Services Card, although we do know it indicates a shift towards more and more citizen self-service, as they call it. In the government's lingo, this is something that's empowering, but in fact it's just the citizens doing the work of government. And again, there's a range of efficiencies that the card is supposed to achieve, and it's just unclear. And it's unclear because they haven't demonstrated how these efficiencies will be achieved. So, vulnerabilities, what did our research project find? And I'm going to have to be a little quick because we started a little bit late, and I don't want to derail the next presentation too much. But there are a number of privacy and security vulnerabilities that could impact citizens' very sensitive personal information. And if you think of your personal information, it's your health information that you really that is really the most sensitive, and the information that you don't want getting out there. People always ask, or they always say, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. Well, that's not the point. I certainly don't want my private medical records being accessed or mistakenly, or with ill intent, because it simply is private. So what we found is that privacy protections are not built into the technical infrastructure of the BC Services Card. It's mandated by policy. And so this makes it vulnerable to internal bad actors, as well as the normal range of external attackers that would attack any technical system like this. Interestingly, and perhaps quite worrisome, is because of the data-linked infrastructure. If one were able to compromise the BC Services Card, it could potentially compromise much broader government networks, and so that it could be a portal into more than just BC Services Card programs. And that we could find no strategic threat and risk assessments were done, and this is a fairly standard thing. And if they were done, they weren't made public. And the basic system or model that the BC Services Card operates on, a federated identity model, is inherently problematic from a privacy perspective, and we outline this in much more detail in our report. But the title of our report is, the BC Services Card, a national ID card by stealth, ? And there are clear plans for a pan-Canadian ID system for online government services delivery. And this system seeks to integrate provinces and possibly municipalities. BC has played a key role, it seems, in the development of foundational policy documents outlining this national ID system and the role that provinces could play. BC was a partner in pilot project testing. The project was a federal-provincial integration. And the same vendor, Secure Key Technologies, who incidentally was invited today but couldn't come, they're providing the same identity credentialing services to both the federal government and the provincial government of BC. And in a sense, and Secure Key is on record as wanting, of course, as vendors would, a national identity system, and their goal of wrapping up Canada by enrolling the rest of the provinces into this identity scheme. And so this brings up this idea of the card cartel. And card cartels are oligopolies of official identification composed of governments, corporations, and technology. As the product of a corporate-driven technocratic approach to identification, card cartels alter what it means to be a citizen by conferring authority to determine and regulate identity to corporate mandates and technology protocols. Thus, it's not merely that governments are outsourcing some services, delegating some tasks to external agencies, but that those agencies, corporations, and technologies help to define and constitute the ID systems themselves. And according to a booklet called Advice to the Premier Designate, which was, I guess, given to Christy Clark when she first took office, in this advice booklet, it was stated that a pan-Canadian approach to identity management has been set as a priority by the cabinet secretaries and the payment card industry, and BC is leading efforts in the design and implementation of the framework. So it's quite clear that there is a connection between the provincial identity system and this overarching pan-Canadian system. I'm going to stop there. I always have more to say, but I never have enough time to say it in. We do make a series of recommendations at the end of our report, and one of them is that, well, the main one is, of course, we support the Privacy Commissioner's recommendations for the BC Services Card, and that one, the first one, is sort of a moratorium, a halt before approaching phase 2 of the card, which I guess we learned later was the actual activation of this chip. A halt until there's a fulsome public consultation. And we add to that, of course, that the government publicize the results of this consultation and incorporate the findings into future identity policy. So reflecting actually what British Columbians want in an identity policy. And we also call for greater transparency, of course. And this is essential for the future development of British Columbia's Identity and Information Management Program, or solution, as the government calls it. And then the final one that I'll mention today is that we recommend public collaboration, not only with the Privacy Commissioner from start to finish, with built-in reviews after, but external computer security specialists and academics regarding the future development of the BC Services Card and the broader identity management program in British Columbia, because this BC Services Card was planned strictly with government bureaucrats and technocrats and the vendor. So it's a very narrowly defined program in the best of hopes. And so this external consultation and vetting really needs to happen. And so I will stop talking and bring up Christian Paquin from Microsoft Research, and he is going to be talking about a potential technical alternative that British Columbia could look at. One of our questions to the government was, had alternatives sincerely been investigated in the desire to update the old care card? And so Christian will lead us through what that might look like.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christian Paquin, or Christian Paquin, depending where from Canada you are. I'm from Montreal originally. I've been working in the security and identity space for a good chunk of time, since the early 2000s. I've been involved with privacy-preserving technologies for a while, starting my career at Zero Knowledge Systems, was a Montreal firm, cryptography company trying to commercialize the equivalent of what now is the Tor network, the privacy anonymous network. Then went on to work with Stefan Brands, who's a well-known researcher in cryptography at Credentica, where we developed the U-Proof technology. I'm going to talk a lot about it today. And then the company was acquired by Microsoft, where I've been working at since 2008. So my goal today is not really to talk about the BC card, mainly because I don't know much about it, the technical details, but to give some ideas about some type of technologies that in general help in identity systems to provide both strong security and also very strong privacy. And talk about my experiences to deal with various identity systems around the planet, or initiatives that are going on in Europe and in the US. And perhaps these ideas might apply here also in BC. So, of course, the slides, I won't spend too much time here. I don't have to convince anybody here that the world is moving online, and especially the government services, because governments around the planet are running out of money and they need to be more efficient and lean and to be able to take people out of buildings and put them online. But of course, as you move high-value transactions online, you also need to increase the identity assurance to make sure to reduce fraud. So all these arguments are perfectly valid. But the question now is how to do that in a manner that preserves, at least when people say privacy enhancing technologies, I don't really like that term. Enhancing what exactly? I call them privacy protecting or preserving technologies. You want to preserve the autonomy and the privacy that you have in real life with real paper credentials when you move online, so that when I walk into a store to buy some liquor and show my driver's license, the government doesn't get notified that I've used this card at this particular location. So if I do some interactions online, I should expect the same type of autonomy and privacy. So, so there's basically two approaches to do that, to do identity systems online. There's the Identity Federation, which is probably the most popular one today because it is very flexible and very easy to deploy and use. There are multiple incarnations of these type of systems online. You might have heard of WS Federation, SAML, OpenID, OAuth, and there are some more recent proprietary ones like Facebook Connect, which allow users to take an identity from one domain and share it across multiple service providers. Another type of system is Pki Public Infrastructure. It's kind of rooted in old enterprise identity management, where everybody has a Pki certificate. It's a very strong identity that it can present in a very secure manner. And everything is, it's a bit conceptually similar to what people do with government-issued identity, like a passport or something. There's a hierarchy, a central party that issues to you a very strong identity, and it's very hard to forge or modify. But there are some interesting privacy characteristics that goes with that. So to further the discussion, let me give kind of pros and cons of these two types of systems. And then I'll go and present a novel idea that's been pushed in the last couple of years in the identity community of a kind of meet in the middle type of system to provide the best of both worlds. So in federated identity, just to very high level, I don't want to be technical in this level, although I can be. If you have any questions, I can go deeper. But essentially in federated architecture, what's going on is I think the Apple Office suite here did not really like my graphics that I put on, with no conversion problem between PC and a Mac, but they got a long way along the years. So in a federated architecture, typically you as a user, you go, and you don't need any special software or any special hardware. You just have a web browser, and you can visit a website that might, as a policy, it needs to either identify you or figure out some attribute about you. That maybe it's an online casino, and you need to prove that you're over 18, or is it 19 here in BC? What's the legal age? I'm not sure. But so let's say over 18, and that you reside in whatever jurisdiction that it's allowed to gamble. So you try to request access, you get back some sort of policy explaining what type of attributes are needed and who can provide this attribute, who's trusted to provide that information. And then the user can click a selection of trusted identity providers, go there, authenticate, get back a signed assertion of this fact, and then it can be presented back to the relying party, which will let you in. So it's very simple. You visit the service provider, they need something, you go fetch that information and you present it. So it's very dynamic online interactions. And the fact that it's easy to deploy, it all uses web technologies, web redirection. You don't need to set up anything in advance between Federation members except a very simple trust establishment, and then all the rest is taken care of. So that's great, but there are some challenges with that approach. Mainly compare, let's say, to username and password. So if I add if I want to authenticate to various websites using different username and passwords, it might be difficult to remember all of them, but at least I have some autonomy and I have some protections. If my one password leaks, I don't lose access to all the other websites I'm accessing. Or if a hacker gets access to one of my passwords, the damage is limited. But in a federated system, if a hacker gets access to my Facebook account that's used to log me in various websites, then I lose all the keys to the kingdoms. Basically, one breach results in a lot of damage. And that's just if you're attacked from outside. If you're attacked from inside, an insider at the identity provider can do a lot of damage, can basically assume the identity of anybody that he or she wants. So it's a shift between the trust model that was existing before. On the privacy front, there's also a lot of concerns, one of which is that the identity provider has a lot of visibility about the activities of the users in the system. So if as I mentioned in my example, if I walk in the store, show my driver's license, the government doesn't know. It's a very offline process. There's a disconnect between the issuance of the credential and its presentation. But if I do that online with a federated system, that I would show my equivalent of my driver's license online, while using a federation system, the government either knows that directly, depending on the protocol, or can figure it out later by comparing nodes, if these databases ever get merged, or if it's very easy to correlate the identifiers that were embedded in these credentials to later build a map of all my activity. And scalability is also a factor. So if instead of just logging in and presenting something offline, I need to go fetch some information from the central party, that means it always needs to be available. So it's harder to build in a high availability system, and it's also more fragile. It's a nice target of attack. The other approach to Pki is slightly different. In this system, you basically get a credential in advance, and then later you can present it to various relying parties. And these credentials, the Pki certificates, are stronger in security because they are tied. There's some cryptographic material that you need, and it makes it invisible to forge or to steal from outside. But the privacy is also more of a problem here. And because these Pki certificates can have attributes in them. If you want to build the equivalent of your driver's license, you can contain your name, your address, date of birth. And if I only want to show that I'm over 18 and I live in BC, I can present this credential, but I also have to disclose my name and my address and my date of birth, and a lot more information than just the minimal aspects that I was requested. And also scalability is more of an issue also because it's more expensive to distribute these keys and set up the revocation, everything you need. So there is a third approach. Has been in the 2000, 2005, there was a discussion that was started in the identity community about the user-centric approach, where essentially you put the user in the center of the transaction and can control and inspect what information is transferred about him. So that's a good architecture model, but also if you combine it with different type of credential technology called minimal disclosure technologies, then you get really great benefits. And what does it do is that basically minimal disclosure technologies are a new type of cryptographic credentials. And you can think about them as PKI with privacy by design built in. And in these technologies, they have credential tokens. Let's call them tokens. And you can think about them like PKI certificates, but there are two main differences. The first one is that the way they are issued to users. PKI certificates are signed using conventional DSA or RSA signatures, technical digital electronic signatures algorithms. But these basically, when they are stamped, it results in unique serial number. A signature is a unique digital fingerprint that if you present at various websites, you're leaving the same number behind. So it's easy to track and trace your activities. But these special signatures in minimal disclosure technologies use what's called a blind signature in cryptography. It's basically a randomized signature so that they all look different. And you can use these credentials to build all sorts, and they've been used in the past to build all sorts of credentials, the equivalent of paper credentials online, from full EID to just anonymous vouchers that you can use to reclaim services or resources, or even cash. Actually, they were developed to build e-cash systems in the beginning. And there's one aspect of like if I want to show the difference between a SAML federated token, for example, and a PKI certificate and a minimal disclosure token, then you want to present it. And when you present a federated token, it's a bit like paying with a credit card. So you're doing this. There's a connection to the issuer, Visa or MasterCard. You're going to authorize a transaction, and they basically learn where you're going. If you pay with a PKI certificate, it's a bit like paying with a dollar bill. You're a bit autonomous. You're not contacting the bank in real time when you use the bill. But the bill has a serial number, all sorts of features that can be recorded. And when you give it to a person in real life, it's okay. But when it's recorded online, this transaction is easily correlatable to its issuance. So you leave the same serial number around. And if you use these things instead, it's a bit like you're using coins. So the coins cannot be forged or modified, but they are undistinguishable. So you have two coins, I don't know if they belong to the same user or even which user they belong. So I can ask the bank will not know, or the central bank say, yeah, I forged that coin, it's mine, but I don't know to which user it belongs. So the cryptographic wrapping provides a lot of protection. And there are no inescapable correlation handles and leakage that are built in the system. And as an example, just to illustrate what I said, say you have a school credential. It's say your name, address, and your program. And you want to access an e-library. So given an unexpected policy, in this case needed to prove that you're a graduate student from Washington State, so you can just minimally disclose this simple amount of information that needs to be, that's requested by the relying party and no more, and be able to present that. And then the unlinkability property is that if this relying party tries to learn more about the student, even contacting the issuer, say, who's that student? I'd like to know more. I'd like to send spam, or I'd like to profile that person. It's impossible to do so. So basically, these type of technologies provide a superset of the features of PKI certificates and federation token, but they also provide above that a lot of interesting features. I don't want to spend too much time on that slide, but essentially you can tie these credentials to trusted devices such as smart cards or phones or TPM, trusted computing chips. You can do the rich disclosure of the data. As I mentioned, instead of if you have, again, the driver license equivalent, a lot of attributes about yourself in this credential, and you present it, instead of simply showing everything that's on the credential, you can prove properties about what's encoded in there. So I could, for example, present a subset of the information. If there's a revocation list, let's say the no-fly list, everybody needs to identify themselves to go on airplanes so that you can prove you're not on the no-fly list. Well, we could do the equivalent of proving that the name that's on my ID card is not on the no-fly list without disclosing my name. And we can do that cryptographically without leaking more information that's needed. And then the security properties is achieved without identifying myself. I can do interval proof. So if there's a date of birth encoded in the credential, I can prove that it is such that I'm over 18 without disclosing its actual value. We can also do what's called domain pseudonyms. A lot of systems today, they don't just want a simple identifier for you to be able to recognize repeat visitors. So if you go to the website, it's the equivalent of picking a username and password. But you might want to derive that from a trusted identity so that only people in the system can access a service under a certain pseudonym. So if you do that using a federation system, the identity provider assigns you a pseudonym. It's going to say you're visiting site A, you're going to be known as ABC. And if you visit site B, you're going to be known as XYZ. But the issuer in that case is very powerful. It learns all these correlations and your various identities in these silos, but can also impersonate you by just issuing to itself a matching credential and accessing in your record, like if there's an insider or hacker that gets access to the issuer system. But using these tokens, you can basically create these pseudonyms locally tied to some private key material that does not leave your system. And you can also derive them from attributes. So let's say you want to do a polling system where users can only come once, but you don't want to identify them. But you don't know if the user is going to pick a pseudonym like Happy Bunny one and then Big Joe, and it might be the same person giving its opinion like 50 times to kind of bias the survey. Well, you can say you want to have a random pseudonym, but it's going to be derived from your social security number or whatever unique identifier you might have. And if you do that, then you're going to end up with the same pseudonym twice, and you will not be able to game the system. So all these things can be built. So basically any type of properties, such as ID escrow, and it might be controversial in some privacy settings. I have a lot of interactions with customers and potential customers of these type of systems. And every time somebody who's might be interested in deploying that for the privacy capabilities, they say, yeah, but what if the terrorists use it? So anonymity is great in some cases, but sometimes we need to figure out who it is. So as technology providers, where there's actually ways we can build ways to de-anonymize a transaction in case of a fraudulent action that takes place. If law enforcement needs to figure out who's behind a certain pseudonym, then there's ways to encrypt your identity in a way that can be decrypted later by a valid party. And this valid party is up to the system to decide. It could be the court system, it could be civil liberty groups, or a combination of both. Anyway, there's a lot of technical capabilities that are available. UProve is a technology that we developed. It's been out there since the mid-90s. Been developed at the Credentica at first and then continued at Microsoft. That's basically what I'm working on. And we did a lot of public releases starting in 2010, and every year we do some more work. These technologies are now open. We've published the protocols, submitted them to ISO. There's open source libraries. We actually had a new release last week. And it's basically one instantiation of what I've been talking about. And you can learn more by going to this link, microsoft.com/uproof, if it's something you'd like to play with. And how it works, I just want to show what, like the other picture, is that a bit like PKI, you get your credentials, your tokens in advance. But then when you want to interact with the relying party, you can just, to enter a specific policy, you can dynamically take a token and present it. And you have multiple of these so that your activities are unlinkable between transactions and between domains. And these credentials can be on on demand, like from in your web browser. They can be issued to you in a long-term fashion on a smart card or tied to your phone or a TPM in your laptop. It's up to the system to decide how to protect them. And we've also built variations where things are not, I don't know if you've heard of CardSpace, this initiative. It was an identity client we've built in Windows systems. It did not ship at the end of the day. The effort was dropped, but there's a new iteration where the identity broker is in the cloud, and the computations are pushed to people's browser in little applets of a light application. So that's way easier to deploy. So we've played with a lot of these things. So the last 5 minutes, I just want to highlight a couple of projects we've been involved with. One of which is more relevant to this discussion today was with the German Eid Card. So the German, a couple of years ago, they released, they started to issue an identity card, and it's very interesting in a privacy way. If you look at their design, they did not opt for PKI certificates like many countries do, which is a simple solution, but have a lot of privacy implications. But they really did a way that you need, in order to query the card, an attribute on the card, you need to have a certificate from the government to be an authorized application, and they kind of control what information you're able to query, and there's minimal disclosure built in. So I think personally it's a good system, but it's very limiting. To be part of this infrastructure, you need to be a recognized application. So you spend a lot of money to develop the system, but the use is very limited. So what we did is we built a way to be able to bootstrap the ID card and be able to use it online at various websites that were not meant to be part of the system. But using these type of tokens, we're able to extend the security and the privacy guarantees of the card all the way to this relying party by putting this minimal disclosure buffer in the middle, and basically putting the user in the system, the same way that your driver's license is intended to prove that you can drive, not that you use to buy liquor. But if there's these side uses that benefits everyone, that can be enabled, and while protecting the privacy of the users and the security of the system for everybody's sake, then it's a good investment, return on investment in a way. So it's something that we've played with. Another one, what's interesting around in Europe, in the US, there is starting to be a bit more funding for pilots to study these type of technologies, because governments are stuck with these problems. They're looking for a solution, and they say the class of technologies are very interesting, but we want to learn more about them. So in Europe, there are a couple of it's called FP7 projects, been funded by the European Commission, and one of them is ABC for Trust, attribute-based credentials for trust. We're part of this consortium, and the goal is exactly that, to study these systems, to build, survey, pilot these technologies. We're collaborating with IBM, which is the other big identity system of anonymous credential like that. It's called IDMX. And we're in the third year now of this project, and there's 2 pilots on the way. For more information, I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, so you can look at this link if you want to learn more about it, or I can talk a bit more later on the panel if you would like some details. And closer to home is in North America. There's the INSTIC initiative that's been started by the White House 2 years ago, which is essentially a vision for EID in the US. It's very different from Canada, of course, because the government does not provide a lot of the services that are done in Canada. So there's no way the government's going to issue identities themselves. Instead, they're going to rely on the private sector to do so, to access potentially government services. But they did put on a vision and some requirements, both on security and privacy. And it's interesting to see all the privacy aspects of that vision document. And what they did is basically they put some money administered by NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, to fund some pilots. And we're actually part of one of these pilots with AMVA, which is basically the association of the driver's licenses, the license offices around the country, and to see what it would be to to be able to provide the equivalent of an electronic driver's license online, and with collaboration with other identity providers also. And it's going to use a system like I presented, this federated broker, and trying to put the privacy protections in place. And hopefully the government will look at these pilots and see the pros and cons and see to move forward to provide stronger security online regarding identity, and also with all the privacy protections that are needed. Finally, last slide between me and the coffee break. I want to put there some criteria, the so-called laws of identities. Kim Cameron is a notorious identity architect at Microsoft, did a big effort in around 2005 around the industry, big discussions around what an identity system on the internet would look like. And basically these came up with so-called laws of identities. And there are basically criteria that you need to respect in order for a system to succeed. If you don't respect one of these, there's a good chance that your system will fail for obvious or not so obvious reason. So when you are building an identity system, it's good to reflect about if all these things are met or not. So open question. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll continue the discussion later with the panel, and I'll give it back to Kate, and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks so much, Christian. Okay, so we are going to have our coffee right now, and we have almost half an hour to hang out and eat and drink and check your email and do whatever. But all the speakers thus far will be available if you wanted to ask questions of us then, or when we return, we'll be all joining a panel, and we'll be discussing the various aspects of the identity card and system in BC, and moderated by Vince Gogolek at the back from BC FIPA. So it promises to be very interesting, and we'll get to more of the things that we didn't get to so far.